The barn stood like a skeleton against the horizon, its timbers rotting, its roof sagging under decades of neglect. Vultures sometimes perched along the ridgepole, black silhouettes against the prairie sky. For most people in Ashgrove, the barn was nothing more than a ruin, a blot of wood and rust on otherwise fertile land. For years, it had been avoided. They said the ground beneath it was cursed, that screams had once been heard drifting from its foundations on moonless nights. When the county put it up for auction, no one raised a hand. Not even old farmers with more land than they could tend. Not even the desperate young couples looking for a bargain. The opening bid had been set at $1, more as a formality than anything. That was when Daniel Cole raised his hand. He wasn't a local, though his grandfather had once lived not far from Ashgrove. He had arrived 3 weeks earlier in a dusty pickup, his belongings stacked beneath a tarp. He had the kind of face that made people look twice, stern, with a scar down his jaw and the wary eyes of someone who had been through too much too young. The townsfolk whispered about him. Soldier, drifter, maybe outlaw. When the gavel fell, and the auctioneer declared, sold, to Mr. Cole, for $1, the crowd erupted in laughter. Hell, he just bought himself a pile of kindling, one man said. Or a coffin, another chuckled. A fool and his money, someone muttered, though it was only $1. Daniel ignored them. He signed the deed, folded the yellowing paper into his jacket, and drove out to the barn. The first time he stepped inside, dust rose in choking clouds. Broken boards littered the floor, and the loft sagged dangerously overhead. Mice scattered from the corners, and the smell of mold pressed down heavy. But it wasn't the decay that made Daniel pause. It was the silence. It was too complete. The air felt heavy, like the hush of a battlefield after the gunfire stopped, when you weren't sure if death was finished collecting. He explored slowly, his boots crunching glass and brittle hay. There were strange marks on the timbers, carved deep into the wood. Some were just initials, the kind of graffiti left by bored farmhands. Others were stranger, symbols he didn't recognize, overlapping lines, spirals that hurt his eyes if he stared too long. But it was the hatch in the far corner that drew him. It was disguised under a pile of rotting sacks, but when he moved them aside, he found a trapdoor, iron-bound, the hinges orange with rust. A length of chain hung from the ring, as though someone had meant to padlock it from above, but there was no lock, only the remnants of one snapped long ago. Daniel knelt, lifted the hatch, and stared into darkness. The air that rose up was damp, cool, and faintly metallic, like old blood. He descended with a lantern, the flame flickering. Beneath the barn was not a simple root cellar. It was larger, carved into the earth with stone walls slick with condensation. Wooden beams supported the ceiling, though some leaned dangerously. And there, bolted to the stone, were chains. Not ordinary chains for livestock. These were thick, blackened with age, anchored into iron rings sunk deep in the rock. The cuffs at their ends were broad enough for human wrists. Daniel touched one. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. His lantern flame fluttered, nearly extinguished. For a long moment he stood there, listening. He thought he heard something, a faint rattle, like breath against metal, but when he turned, there was only silence. Word spread quickly in town that Daniel was fixing up the barn. People laughed again, saying he must be crazy. A few stopped by to jeer, leaning against his fence as he hauled out rotten planks and burned them. "You gonna keep cows in there, Cole?" one man shouted. "Or ghosts," another said. "Best thing you can do is burn it down." "But you'll see, things in that place don't stay quiet." Daniel never answered. He kept working, day after day, his muscles burning, sweat dripping, the barn slowly reshaping under his hands. He patched the roof, replaced broken beams, and cleared out the overgrowth strangling the walls. But he never spoke about the basement. Not even when the sheriff came by, leaning on his cruiser. "Son," Sheriff Maddox said, chewing on a toothpick, "that barn's got history. Folks don't talk about it much, but they remember. Best leave it be." Daniel only replied, "History doesn't scare me." The sheriff studied him, then shook his head. "Some histories ain't just stories." Nights in the barn were the hardest. Daniel had set up a cot in the loft while he worked. The first few nights were quiet, though the wind moaned through the cracks. But soon, he began to hear it, the faint scrape of chains beneath the floor. Sometimes it was slow, dragging, like something shifting position after centuries of stillness. Sometimes it was sharp, sudden, a clank that echoed through the beams. Once, near midnight, he swore he heard a whisper. Just a single word, too faint to understand. He told himself it was imagination, exhaustion. He had spent years in places where nightmares crawled out of the dark. Afghanistan, Fallujah, so a creaking barn shouldn't shake him. But something about the chains gnawed at him. So one night, he went back down with the lantern. The air was colder than before. His breath fogged. And the chains, God help him, looked different. He was sure they had shifted. A cuff that had hung flat against the wall now jutted out, suspended, as if someone had tried to pull free. He reached for it, and the lantern sputtered. For a moment the light went out entirely, and in that abyss he heard it clearly, a low voice, guttural, whispering his name. When the flame returned, the cellar was empty. The chains hung lifeless, but Daniel stumbled back up the ladder, heart pounding. Dash dash dash. Word of strange things began to leak out into town. Children claimed to see lights in the barn windows when Daniel swore there were none. Hunters passing at night said they heard clanking, carried on the wind. Dogs barked and refused to go near. The townsfolk began to whisper again, not with laughter this time, but unease. And then came the night they saw. A storm had rolled in, heavy rain turning the roads to rivers. Lightning lit the fields, and thunder cracked like cannon fire. A few townsfolk had gathered at the diner, watching the storm through fogged glass. From there, the barn was visible in the distance, a dark silhouette against the flashes. And in one of those flashes, they saw the doors burst open. Chains, long, gleaming, snaked out into the mud, as if dragged by invisible hands. They whipped and coiled, striking sparks against the stone foundation. The laughter died in their throats. By the next morning, the whole town knew. Dash dash dash. Daniel was at the barn, sitting on the porch he had built. He looked tired, older somehow. The sheriff approached cautiously, accompanied by 2 deputies. Behind them, a small crowd gathered at a distance, not daring to come closer. "Cole," the sheriff said, "we need to know what's in that basement." Daniel stared at the horizon. For a long time, he didn't answer. Finally, he said, something that should have never been chained. Something that's been waiting. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Waiting for what? Daniel turned his scarred face toward him. His eyes were bloodshot, haunted. For me. Dash dash dash. That was when the chains began to rattle again, even though the cellar hatch was closed. Louder this time, violent, as though whatever lay beneath was struggling harder. The townsfolk who had laughed now stood frozen, pale as ghosts. Some fled, others crossed themselves, and Daniel rose slowly, walked to the hatch, and laid his hand on it. "You laughed," he said softly, not looking at the crowd. "But you didn't know. You couldn't know." He lifted the hatch. The cold that poured out was like winter itself. The lanterns flickered, and from the darkness below, the chains slithered upward, hungry. Dash dash dash. The town of Ashgrove was never the same again. No one laughed about Daniel Cole anymore. Because they all saw the chains in the basement. And some swore they saw what wore them. Something too tall, too thin, with eyes like burning coals. And Daniel, the man who had bought the barn for $1, descended into the dark with it, closing the hatch behind him. The chains rattled once more, then fell silent. The barn still stands today. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, people say you can hear him down there, keeping whatever waits in the basement from breaking free.